The U.S. Constitution, in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 states, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law." This means that the federal government is funded through Congress's appropriations. Congress created the United States House Committee on Appropriations in 1865, which currently contains 12 subcommittees, each being responsible to produce a bill that funds particular departments and areas of the government. The Anti-Deficiency Act was originally passed in 1884 and prohibits federal agencies from obligating or expending federal funds in advance or in excess of an appropriation. This means that when Congress fails to enact the annual appropriation bills from each of the 12 subcommittees, the government enters a shutdown and federal agencies must cease all non-essential functions until Congress acts. But if Congress enacts some, but not all, of the 12 appropriation bills, then only agencies without appropriations have to shut down, and this would be known as a partial shutdown. The Congressional Research Service explains that the Anti-Deficiency Act generally prohibits agencies from continued operation in the absence of appropriations, and failure to comply with the act may result in criminal sanctions, fines, and administrative discipline, including suspension without pay or even removal from office. For every bill, spending measures must pass both the House and Senate and then be signed by the President to become law. Congress conducts an annual appropriations process for each fiscal year, which begins every October 1st. If regular appropriations bills are not signed into law before the start of the new fiscal year, then Congress can pass a continuing resolution, sometimes referred to as a CR, which provides temporary funding in the interim period before regular appropriations bills are passed. However, if a new fiscal year begins or a continuing resolution expires without Congress appropriating new funds, then there will be a lapse in funding and a government shutdown. Before the 1980s, funding gaps did not typically have any major effects on government operations. Government agencies would often continue to operate during a lapse in appropriations, with the expectation that funding would be provided in the future. The agencies simply minimized all non-essential operations and obligations, such as hiring, grant making, and non-emergency travel, believing that Congress never intended the agencies to shut down. In the early 1980s, however, United States Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti wrote a series of legal opinions calling for a stricter interpretation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. He believed that government agencies had no legal means to operate during a funding gap. His letter to President Carter stated, "It is my opinion that during periods of lapsed appropriations, no funds may be expended except as necessary to bring about the orderly termination of an agency's functions, and that the obligation or expenditure of funds for any purpose not otherwise authorized by law would be a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act." Former Editor-in-Chief of Government Executive Tom Shoup explained that the Attorney General was presumably well-meaning and never intended to invent the idea of a government shutdown. Civiletti was just providing legal advice to President Carter on what should happen in the event of a lapse in appropriations at an agency. In fact, Civiletti himself told the Washington Post in 2019, "I couldn't have ever imagined these shutdowns would last this long of a time and would be used as a political gambit," claiming his analysis has been used in ways that were not imagined at the time. Nevertheless, beginning with the appropriations process for fiscal year 1982, many subsequent funding gaps have resulted in a shutdown of affected agencies in which day-to-day operations halt and employees are furloughed without pay. The U.S. Office of Personnel Management published guidance for federal agencies and employees in the event of a shutdown, noting that in a shutdown furlough, an affected agency would have to shut down any activities funded by annual appropriations that are not accepted by law. Typically, an agency will have very little to no lead time to plan and implement a shutdown furlough. During shutdowns, many federal employees are furloughed. They're told not to report to work, though under the Government Employee Fair Treatment Act of 2019, they get paid retroactively when the government reopens. Government employees who provide what are deemed essential services, such as air traffic control and law enforcement, continue to work, but also do not get paid until Congress takes action to end the shutdown. Social Security and Medicare benefits continue to be provided because they are authorized by Congress in laws that do not need annual approval, although some of their services offered by Social Security benefit offices may be limited. In addition, the Treasury may continue to pay interest on U.S. Treasury debt on time. Beyond the damage caused to federal employees, J.P. Morgan economist Michael Ferrari estimates that each week A shutdown subtracts about 0.1% from annualized GDP growth via reduced government activity. There have been 15 funding gaps since the Civiletti opinions, including the most recent government shutdown that began on October 1st of 2025. The majority of these shutdowns were very brief, sometimes simply lasting over a weekend, and therefore they averted any major government disruptions. However, since 1981, there have been 4 major government shutdowns lasting at least 4 business days and broadly impacting government operations. The longest of those was the most recent before the current 2025 one, which lasted 34 full days from December 22nd, 2018 through January 24th of 2019. The Peter G. Peterson Foundation published a call to lawmakers to work on bipartisan solutions to put the United States on a long-term sustainable fiscal path, noting that government shutdowns do not occur in peer countries because their governments do not react to a lapse in funding bills by shutting down operations. Instead, they implement shorter-term solutions, such as continuing to operate the government at the amount budgeted the year before, or longer-term solutions such as holding elections so a new government can pass the annual budget. Analyzing how Germany, South Korea, and the United Kingdom operate, the foundation concludes what those countries share is the understanding that their governments must not shut down because of their legislature's impasse. The 2025 shutdown is different than the previous ones. David Wessel of Brookings explains that Trump is taking a stance different from those of his predecessors and directing federal agencies to use this opportunity to consider reduction in force notices for massive numbers of federal employees. How did we get here? This shutdown happened in response to Democrats and Republicans failing to pass a bill to fund the government into October. Although the Republicans currently control both the House and the Senate, they are still short of the 60 votes needed in the Senate to pass the spending bill without some Democrat buy-in. On the night of September 30th, ABC News reported that the federal government ran out of money after a Democratic-backed spending bill that would have extended health care subsidies under the Affordable Care Act and reversed cuts to Medicaid failed, as well as the GOP-backed stopgap funding measure that would have funded the government for 7 weeks also failed. The Affordable Care Act, sometimes referred to as Obamacare, established a premium tax credit in 2014, a federally financed subsidy based on income and household size to lower payments toward premiums to enroll in qualified healthcare plans. Passed in response to the COVID pandemic, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021 expanded eligibility for and the amount of the premium tax credit for tax years 2021 and 2022. And then the fiscal year 2022 budget reconciliation law extended the provision for 3 additional tax years, 2023 through 2025. While the premium tax credit does not contain any sunset provisions, and thus will continue beyond 2025, the temporary provision that expanded income eligibility and enhanced subsidy amounts is set to expire at the end of the year, and the Senate Democrats' demand that these subsidies be extended led in large part to the stalemate over funding the government. The Democratic leadership in the House echoed these sentiments, with House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries insisting that his party wants the tax credits for the Affordable Care Act to become permanent. Chris Towner, Policy Director for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, estimates that making the enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies permanent would cost about $350 billion over a decade, and the Democrats' proposal in its entirety, which would also repeal the health spending cuts that were included in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, would add $1.5 trillion to the national debt over the next decade. The White House claims that Democrats shut down the government over free health care for illegal aliens, and the Democrats' proposal would result in nearly $200 billion spent on health care for illegal immigrants and other non-citizens over the next decade. While many have pushed back against these claims, even the National Immigration Forum, an immigrant advocacy nonprofit, published a report in 2022 showing that undocumented immigrants do consume a small fraction of total health expenditures, and even though undocumented immigrants are largely ineligible for federal health care programs like Medicaid and Medicare and are ineligible for most federal health care benefits, under the current law, they nevertheless may access federal benefits such as emergency Medicaid, access to treatment in hospital emergency rooms or access to health care and nutrition programs under the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, known as WIC. It also cited to recent Medicaid data showing that the federal government spent $974 million in total on emergency and life-saving services for undocumented immigrants in 2016. More recently, a 2024 Congressional Research Service publication analyzed non-citizens' access to health care and also noted that while in general unauthorized immigrants are not eligible for federal health care coverage programs, non-citizen eligibility varies by program and immigration status, and many programs allow specific categories of non-citizens with certain forms of legal status to access benefits with varying restrictions. This report also notes that while federal law excludes non-qualified aliens from many types of federal health insurance coverage, they may be able to receive some health services supported through federal grant programs, regardless of their ability to pay, and that states also administer grants from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that serve as another potential source of care for non-citizens. On October 15th, U.S. District Judge Susan Ilston in San Francisco issued a temporary restraining order blocking Trump's plan to lay off over 4,000 federal workers due to the shutdown, finding that Trump's issuance of reduction in force notices in response to the shutdown was politically motivated and contrary to the laws. As of Friday afternoon, October 17th, the current shutdown is now the third longest funding lapse in modern history, on day 17 with no end in sight after senators failed for the 10th time to resolve the impasse.